All right, welcome back, dear viewers. I don't usually make these sort of videos because, well, I'm just hesitant to do it. I think there's a lot of talking heads on ye old YouTube that have a lot of big opinions about this, that, and the other thing, and I'm of the opinion that game mastery is not an ivory tower, you know, theory crafting sort of thing. It's something you do, and it's something that you have to practice. It's a lot. I've said this before, but it's a lot like the practice of law. It's not a method. It's not a algorithm. It is not a process. It's a practice. You start off knowing a lot, and the more you do it, you get a much deeper understanding of the law, and it's very similar to game mastery. The more you do it, the deeper understanding you're going to get out of everything that you're doing. Um, and frankly, in that light, it's one of the reasons why I started the second watch, because I think one of the better ways of getting becoming a better game master is not just sitting around watching YouTube videos, but talking to other game masters, getting involved in a conversation, seeing how they do things, what works, what doesn't, uh, and sort of making those connections with another game master and learning from them. It's one of the reasons why I chose Gary. Gary and I and DM Cloaker Brian, we got together a few years back during the halcyon bygone days of COVID, to do a podcast, and we did it for about 9 months or so. It was fun, but I got to know those guys really well, and they're some great game masters. And I would not want to have a conversation, a live stream conversation with anyone but them. They're just really good and open-minded and thoughtful guys. They've certainly made me a better game master. And that's sort of like where the beginning point is for all of this. Um, I want to have a conversation with you, and I hope you join me and Gary on the second watch, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 10 Central, Friday nights. We get into a deep conversation about whatever topics on our mind that week. Sometimes we hit upon topical news. Sometimes it's just some random game we want to talk about. Um, but we have a pretty active chat too, which is great, and I really appreciate everyone who's been showing up. It's been the past few weeks have been awesome. The past couple months have been awesome ever since we started this whole thing. So thank you. I appreciate it. I hope everyone hits like, subscribe, bell icon, yada yada yada, um, because there's going to be more like this. Gary and I have a lot to say, and it's not just theory crafting nonsense. It's practical experience. So yeah, so let's start there. But I have to actually start a little bit of theory crafting, a little bit, just to kind of start, and just so you understand where I'm coming from. So I've been doing this for a long time, and along the way, I picked up a lot of tools, what I would consider tools. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's only one way to do something, because I don't believe that's true at all. I believe that a game master sits down and says to themselves, "Hey, I want to start this new campaign." Uh, and then there's all these things they think about, and then boom, they have this new campaign worked out. Some campaigns are going to be better than others. Some combination of tools are going to be better than others. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of consideration that goes into the creation of the campaign. And this kind of goes into something I mentioned a few weeks ago on the live stream with Gary. Um, Game master is game designer. I don't mean game designer in the Alexander McCrease uh, way, where you sit down and you create the Adventure Conqueror King system, or Kelsey Dion and you make Shadow Dark, or Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson and you make D&D. I don't mean that. I don't mean it like that. What I mean is you have a toolbox of things that you can use as a game master, and when you sit down, you start pulling from your toolbox and figuring out what works, what you want to work together and put together, and present to your players as your next campaign, because that's going to be the game. I uh, I mentioned Saul Kripke on that, um, that live stream. He's a philosopher of language from the 20th century. I'm not going to go into too deep into it because it drove me crazy when I was in college. But um, philosophy of language is just really analytical and deep. It'll drive you crazy, but it's also very interesting. Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, Karl Popper. Uh, if you want to read about those guys, go for it. I'm not going to talk about him here. I only bring up Saul Crippy because his baptism theory of naming has been on my mind for the past few weeks, and that's how I sort of view the game master's creation of a game. Okay. Uh, Baptism theory of naming essentially goes: the very first time we as a humanity encounters a phenomenon of our reality, we name it. And the utterance itself is completely arbitrary. There's nothing really necessary about it. It's just sort of this group of phonemes that we just kind of, spit out. Unga unga tree, unga unga rock, right? And then, but the moment we point to the thing and say that's a tree, that's a rock, it's forever a tree and a rock. Then it becomes necessary. It's the baptism. It's like, you are hereby Lord Mattias. They dip the baby in the water. That's not exactly what happened when I was baptized, but something like that. And I think the same thing happens when a game master sits down and starts putting together a game. And why it's important to talk to other game masters and constantly learn and experiment, because your toolbox is going to get bigger. But they sit down and they start rummaging through their toolbox and they start pulling things out, and then they put them together and then they create a game. Boom, they have a game. This is the game I'm running on Saturday nights, Friday nights, Sunday afternoons, whatever. Is it going to involve one-to-one time or flex time? Is it going to be an open world or something, just a dungeon crawl? Is it going to be, in the Forgotten Realms or Spelljammer or Homebrew? What kind of tone? Is it going to be horrific, high adventure? There's all these things. And it could even include how many players you're looking for, or that, or on the flip side, the number of players that you have will influence some of the decisions you make as you're rummaging through your toolbox. To mix metaphors, it's like a chef, right? It's a saucier sitting there with the pan and he's throwing stuff in there and then he's tossing it around, put in a little bit of this, a little bit of that, sprinkle of that, and then they put it on the plate and hand it to their players, and that's the campaign, that's the baptism. And at that point, that is necessary. And I brought that up because there's this tension in all the talking heads, ivory tower stuff, where it's like, oh, there's if you don't play this way, you're a relativist and you're a terrible person, or you're a gross nerd, or you're awful game master. If you're not worried about narrative and story, you're creating a boring experience, or if you don't use one-to-one time, you're this, or if you don't use raw or whatever, all that stuff. But and they'll present a good argument as to why this versus that, right? But whenever I listen to it, there's like this tension where I'm like, yeah, but, and the but is the idea that as the game has always been a mode of experimentation with our imagination and putting rules to our imagination. And there is something to be said about what some people call Rule Zero. I don't know if it's proper to call it Rule Zero, what I'm getting at, but Game Master does have this level of authority to create a game and present it to their players, whether it's first edition D&D with a few minor house rules tweaks to it to suit someone's taste, to something radically different like a kit bashed game setting using, I don't know, Blades Against Blades Against the Dark or whatever it's called. No, I can't remember the name of that game, but something like that. They're just kit bashing a bunch of stuff. All of that to me is perfectly legitimate, but it runs contrary to some of these arguments, and I think the baptism theory solves that. Everything that everyone's talking about are tools, and those arguments for why you should use those tools are good guideposts for when you should use them, but they're not necessary. They become necessary the moment you connect them together and baptize your game. All right, so theory crafting done. I'm moving on. All right, I hope you're with me, still with me. If you turned it off, I wouldn't blame you. So in that line, that vein, the first thing you need to do, I think, or should consider, is ask yourself what it is you want to do. That sounds kind of silly, right? Like kind of almost an obvious question. What is it that you want to do? But I think it's a very profound question. It's an important question you should ask yourself, because it's going to inform you on what tools you should start looking at in your toolbox. I think it also, if it's something that you are passionate about or really, really interested in, and that'll translate to your players. They'll pick up on it and they'll be interested. They'll be passionate about it and they'll be along for the ride, whatever it is that you put together. So what is it that you want to do? What experiment that is kind of on the edge of your mind, if you're like one of those kind of game masters that really likes to challenge yourself, or what genre, what appendix N, your own personal appendix N literature that you've been reading has got you excited. What is it that you want to do? In terms of the Lamentations of Elemental Evil campaign, at the time, so it was like, what, 2.5, 3 years ago when I started really thinking about it, I had listened to an actual play. Now, truth be told, I'm not big on actual plays, which I know is coming from this guy who's got a lot of actual plays on his channel. It's not one of my favorite things to do, but I will put them on in the background when it's something interesting. And Fantastic Dimensions, it's a YouTube channel that's kind of defunct, but Ian Christensen, the game master from that channel, ran an 8-part series of the classic Castle Ravenloft, but using Lamentations of the Flame Princess, and it was a very interesting game. And a lot of fun to listen to. It's like I put it in the background and I'd work and then I'd stop what I was doing to listen to something specific that was going on. But it got me thinking, what would happen if you took Lamentations of the Flame Princess and ran it through a more classic mega dungeon? And that's where I picked up Gary Gygax's Temple of Elemental Evil and started reading it. And so that was like number one. What do I want to do? I want to play rules as written, strict Lamentations of the Flame Princess. Temple of Elemental Evil. I want to do a mega dungeon game. That's what I want to do. And as I started reading through the book, I started seeing things like, okay, so there's this actual large hex that's part of the Greyhawk setting. And I'm not a fan of Greyhawk. All due respect, it's just not my thing. It's just not my thing. I'm not a fan of Greyhawk. I certainly didn't want to put it in Forgotten Realms. I used to love first edition Forgotten Realms, but Wizards of the Coast killed it with all its weird melodrama, and it was like watching a freaking slow moving train wreck with the music of like some crappy soap opera going on in the background. So I put it in like a default homebrew setting that I've been working on off and on for better part of a decade. And it was cool because I got to add something called the Borderlands, which I know is kind of cliched, but I got to put that in my world, and it helped define another nation and its relation to the Arn Kingdom and what was going on, and that also helped decide for me a few other things that I wanted to do, which we won't get into here, but that's what I wanted to do. I want to play a dark fantasy setting, where there's going to be some faction play, which is another thing I noticed in the Temple of Elemental Evil, which I don't think a lot of people talk about. There's some opportunities for really good faction play. So, I wanted something dark fantasy, political faction play. I wanted to do a mega dungeon, and I wanted Lamentations of the Flame Princess rules as written. And that's where I started. And then I started working on a map. And that's what it's really turned into, a sandbox. Because, well, I tend to think a little bigger than I initially anticipate, and it kind of took on a life of its own as I started like drawing the map, and that's when I got the idea to incorporate other more fantasy-like Lamentations module, some of the earlier stuff that James Raggi had written, to put them on the map. So there was like this theme, dark fantasy theme going on. I think the weirdest, strangest module I picked was Kelvin Green's More Than Meets the Eye, because they had like these weird transforming aliens in it. But everything else was could easily fit into Mystara, Forgotten Realms, any other like classic fantasy setting. It just has a dark twist, you know. So I put that in there along with a few homebrew materials, and it actually made for a really fun project. And I spent like, I don't know, a couple weeks on it, a couple hours a day, and then I had, you know, drawing up, writing up the encounter tables for when they're traveling across the map, some of the homebrew maps, all that stuff. I picked up one of these, and that's kind of how I run the entire game. This isn't the actual book. I don't know where I put it at the moment. It's probably behind me. In fact, I think I see it right there. Um, but yeah, and then that's it. So that's what I wanted to do, and that's where I started. And I started rummaging through. I was not going to mess around with 1-to-1 time because I didn't know who I was going to have play. I was not going to, obviously not going to do an open world, and I'll show you the map some other time, but I wasn't going to do an open world thing because I wanted to do the Temple of Elemental Evil. So I chose that as sort of like a theme. Vendor Satanis talks about that. You know, pick 3 things that are like the theme of your campaign, and mine was mushrooms because of Zuckmoy, dark fantasy, faction play, and the temple is the source of all evil in the Borderlands. It's kind of point in that direction. Players didn't have to go there right away if they didn't want to, but it was there. Yeah. So and then I created this game, and I created this map, and we've been playing for almost 3 years now. And you know, I'd like to say at this point it was a success. Though looking back, there's some things I would do differently, and we'll talk about that as I go through this series. Um, in which case, I'm going to leave you with this too. You should be honest with yourself. If you make a mistake, learn from it. You know, it's fine to reflect on what you've done and what's worked and what hasn't, because that's part of getting that deeper knowledge of game mastery. So, all right, well, that's it. I hope you sat through this entire video, and I hope you found some use for it. Go out and create your own game, create your own campaign, and have fun doing it. And hit like, subscribe, you know, the usual. And I hope I see you Friday nights in the second watch. All right, take care.